Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this very special event. I'm thrilled that this evening we have an online launch for And Find on the Wall. We've got so much to talk about with this extraordinary book, but I would first of all like to introduce Ruth Huddleston, who is the publisher at Old Barn Books, and I would like to say a few words first.
Thank you so much, everybody, for turning up tonight. Thank you, Nikki, for hosting this launch. Thank you, Anne, for putting your faith in Old Brown Books. We're a micro publisher, basically a one-woman business, to be honest, more of a dream than a publisher. So when we were brought together by the fantastic Jake Hope, I was more than a little intimidated at the thought of working with Anne. All of our books are particularly empathetic. They're books that move me in very strongly. I have to say there's no fillers on this list. So I had seen the manuscript about Aftershocks. I was very excited at the thought of publishing it. But still, how was I going to get on with Anne? Well, in our first phone conversation, we bonded in our conversation over a chicken and chip shop in the Fossil Road in Coventry. Yes, she wanted me specifically to mention that it was chicken and chips shop. Anne was living above this shop in the 70s when I was growing up in a residential special school about a mile down the road with my parents who were both teachers. So after we'd explored our common history, I realized that we were going to get on just fine. Aftershocks, which many of you must know, went on to be a Times and Sunday Times Book of the Week and is a really strong read for 12 and up to 14-year-old if you haven't tried it. Then Anne sent me On the Wall, again, a strike to the heart, an amazing treatment of a disparate group of children all brought together in the first year of new school and how they gradually come together. But I don't want to spoil the rest of the conversation. I'm sure that Nikki's going to bring Anne to tell you all about how the book actually came about and how she was inspired to write it. For me, as a child of teachers, I was particularly pleased to see that she writes not just from the point of view of the children, but also from the teachers and the parents' point of view with such an empathy and a light touch. It's a very funny book. And I know that a lot of people who've already read it are writing to us to tell us how much they've been touched by this book already. In fact, the illustrator of the cover is a guy called Keaton Henson. Is not a children's book illustrator. He's a musician and he's a neighbor. He was round here one evening and I was telling him how I was struggling to try and envisage, I'm not a good visual person, what to do with the cover. And I told him the story of the book. The next morning, he messaged me and said that he couldn't get the story of the book out of his head and he wanted to try illustrating it. And as a very anxious person himself, I think he really empathized with some of the characters in this book. I think it really comes across. And I really hope that all the rest of you will come to enjoy it and to love the characters the way we do.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for that lovely, really heartfelt introduction to the book. I would like to really welcome you to this evening and to celebrate your book. I think I wanted to start by saying that On the Wall is a very different book to Aftershocks. Aftershocks did take us into some quite difficult and traumatic territory. I just wondered whether you needed some space after that book to write something completely different.
Well, I wasn't really intending to write anything. when I finish a book, I kind of wait. I mean, I wait for the nudge of the next one. Martin Amis called it that, and I think it's a brilliant idea. And mostly, I just sit around reading and living my life, and I wait and see what happens. And so I was just doing the normal reading, and I do tend to go down rabbit holes with reading, and I'd gone down a rabbit hole about something which is at some level completely alien to me because I come from a big family in a small house, and I have 2 children, I have a dog, I have a partner, um, and and I don't like being isolated, though I do like a lot of, time on my own, but I became terribly interested in these strange people who go off, not entirely as hermits, living in icy wastes, but people, especially women, who go off to sort of settle themselves and find themselves. And reading about all this silence and people who are on their own and finding themselves in peace and quiet, I was thinking, as you always do when you read a book, you think, and this is why this books are so good for children, isn't it? You think, I'm not like that, or I'm rather like that. And I was thinking, I'm not like this at all. If you put me on a Scottish island in a cottage all by myself, I'd go mad. I mean, I really couldn't stand more than 2 days of it. But there is a child I know around here, and I've been watching him since he was in his cradle, and he is the most peaceable child you've ever come across. And I was thinking, how does he deal with school? Because when I look back at my own schooling, in which I was very happy, it was it was quieter, to be fair. We didn't work in groups nearly as much. We worked in silence a huge amount. It was seen as made you more able to concentrate. And I go in enough primary schools to know that there's a lot more cooperative working in them now. And I don't like being cooperative. Uh, I'm not at all cooperative by nature in person. I mean, I'm a bit of a control freak about the books until it gets to the publication level. So I was thinking, how would he cope? And that's how the book began. That was the nudge. How would a child like this one I've known since he was sitting calmly in his pram, how would he cope when he went to secondary school? In fact, he coped brilliantly. But the book took off, as they always do. I mean, books go areas you don't expect them to go. They went from where I expected it to be, which was the effect that the school would have on Finley, and it turned into what effect Finley has on the school, which is, of course, the great laugh. And that's when it became tremendously liked book because, of course, he mystifies everybody in the staff room. And some of them know him from coming up from the feeder primary, and they know him very well. And others just have to learn to get along with him. I just found it a fascinating book to write. I so enjoyed writing it. I haven't enjoyed writing a book so much since I wrote The More the Merrier after I was the laureate. And that was years ago.
There's lots of things there that I'd like to pick up and go into in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, let's introduce Finley properly to our listeners. And I want to say that he was a character that I had fallen in love with in the first half page. And he had an effect on me when I was trying to think what that effect was. It was about a sense of calm, which I really enjoyed. But how did he develop for you through the writing of this book? Where did he start off and where did he finish?
Well, if I'm honest, books, when they start off, the characters start off as sort of ciphers. I would say they have fairly minimalist personalities. You tend to take a little bit of one person and a little bit of another person, and you just eke them out and make them grow a bit. And then gradually they become alive. So you might have a shy person, or you might have, in the case of Akeem, for example, who has a temper, which he hasn't quite learnt to control. That's him. He's just a child with a temper. And then you have Ben, and he's the class clown. And that's all I give them at the beginning. But they grow under the pen because I'm a very, very slow writer. And so it will take at least a year to write even a book that is quite short and easy like this one. And as they grow, of course, you get corralled as the author. I mean, the character is, I'm not going to go there, or I'm not going to do this, or this is not actually what a child like this would do. And so he began as just a quiet child. And actually, he doesn't change much. He doesn't change much in the book. He lives in his own peaceable kingdom. He seems to have this carapace around him of tranquility. And people come to him, and he isn't bossy. He doesn't ever give them real advice. He just says what he thinks. And somehow, because he doesn't strive, there's no striving in this child. I mean, if you taught him, you might actually get a bit cross with the fact that he doesn't try and change much. And I do think that I admire children. I mean, I have a child who grew to about 13 and then decided she wanted to be different, in a way, richer and better. And she made an effort, and she did. And I mean, there was nothing wrong with her before, but she became more impressive. And there's none of that in Finley. He's just self-contained. He's not smug. So I don't know how he grew, really, Nikki. I mean, I just don't know.
And he surprised you right to the very end, as you say in your author's note. He does something that surprised you in the last page, really.
He does.
Mm. I wonder if we could help a reading.
This chapter's called Serene, and it takes place in the staff room. And we're quite a way into the book by now, so the staff do know this child. I blame myself, Julian Goodhue confessed to everyone in the staff room. It's entirely my fault that they caught on to this idea of treating Finley as if he's some sort of deity. There he was, staring calmly ahead of him, while all the rest of them were fussing away about some tiny alteration of their routine that I had just announced, and I made the mistake of asking him if he had taken the change on board. But Julian, said Miss Elliman, how could that possibly have set all this off? Mr. Goodhue shrugged. It was the way I said it, I suppose. I stood in front of him and sort of slid my hands sideways up to imaginary, drooping Grand Vizier's sleeves and bowed to him and asked, "O most serene one, did that room change announcement register with you, or must I go through it all again?" Mrs. Lapinska chuckled. "And that was all you said?" "Yes, that was all I said, but it was clearly quite enough to set Ben Fuller off." "It was all right when it was just your lot outside at break," grumbled Mrs. Clements. "I found it quite amusing to watch them gathering round his perch on the wall and pretending to worship him. But now it's half the school. They break stride every time they see him coming towards them down the corridor, and bow and scrape as if he'd just stepped off a cloud or something. And all the rest of them are stopping to watch and causing log jams and getting to classes late." "To be fair to the boy," said Mr. Porter, "he isn't trying to encourage them. He doesn't play up to it or lose his temper. He barely even responds. He just keeps going, rather as if the whole pack of them were as good as invisible." "Well, that's how he is," said Mrs. Harris. "Imperturbable." "Serene," said Mr. Goodhue, "which is all I said. It's just that now I really wish I hadn't."
I love those insights in the staff room. Of course, having been a teacher, I recognise so much in those conversations there. And it is about the impacts that Finley has, not only on the other children, but on the adults as well. And these teachers are all trying to do their best. I think that's one of the things that comes across. But the systems in school don't always allow for the differences in children when they're as extreme as they are for Finley. But you do see teachers trying to navigate that and try to do what's right.
Absolutely. And I do think teachers do an amazing job Because when you think about what a school has to do, they have to take children who have different social backgrounds, different intellectual levels, different expectations, different temperaments. Everything about them is different. And the only thing they have in common is a chronological age. And somehow the teacher is expected to teach them all to the best of the child's ability and to get them all to shake down together. And I have, in my time, I've been into so many primary schools and almost as many secondary schools. And I'm always lost in admiration for how they do it and for the fact that they manage to do it for almost every child. They do make jokes about it. I mean, the science teacher, so somebody's going on about the fact that he spreads tranquility through the classroom often and causes peace and knows how to calm down Akeem when he's in his tantrums. And one of them says, we should have one of these in every class. Bring me his fingernails and I will clone him in the laboratory. We all want one of these. I'm always amazed at how well teachers know children. And Mr. Goodhue, who is, I mean, they're a classic form teacher. He knows everybody in his class. He doesn't always come out with it, but you can see behind the scenes. The other thing that made this book a pleasure to write was to be back in the third person, be back in the omniscient narrator, because you can look down and you can just like shine a spotlight on just one conversation in a staff room and then one conversation on the wall and one conversation in the playground. And they're very short little vignettes. And gradually everybody gets illuminated more and more and more. And I like bringing adults in Flower Babies, which was, I think, a lot of people's favorite book. There is a lot about the adults in the staff room. And I have a feeling that one of the problems now is that so many of the books that our children read are written in the first person, which does limit the writing and the comedy because you're only seeing the viewpoint, almost without exception in children's literature, the child. Whereas if you've got an author who is the narrator, they can drop in on the staff room. It gives you much more freedom. And to be fair, much more freedom to be funny. I mean, because everybody's jokes, not just one person's.
I think the other thing just to say about the teachers is that you give them a life outside the classroom as well. So they become people. Mr. Goodhue is also Julian, and he goes out and he shops. He's not just in school. Some children do think that teachers live in school, that they don't have exterior lives. Early on in the book, when I can't remember if it's Juliet who's asking Finley what he's doing, she runs through a list of things. Are you thinking? No, I'm not thinking. Are you meditating? No, I'm not meditating. Are you watching? Are you playing? Are you worrying? And he says, no, I'm not doing any of those and I'm not thinking. But he says, I do have thoughts, but I don't actually think them. What do you mean by that?
Call me a mad woman if you will, but that's what I do on walks with my dog. I walk the dog every day for about an hour, and I find that I'm thinking but not thinking. I mean, I'm not thinking. Actually, one of the things my ex-hubby always said about me is he said, the trouble with you is you simply cannot think. And I can't think ahead. I'm entirely intuitive. I can't play chess, for example, to save my life. I'm just not a thinker. Things just drift. And then I know if they're right or not. They either chime in with, you think, oh, I've got that, or you don't. And I don't think I'm entirely alone in this. I mean, we're not all, what was his name? Gary Kasparov by nature.
Also, Finley is a little bit like some writers where things, as you've said, come into his head. It's more akin with daydreaming, perhaps, than it is with thinking.
It possibly is, but he does think occasionally. There's an occasion when he's in the park and he's been ticked off, basically, by 3 separate teachers, one of whom is too kind to do anything other than sigh heavily, but the other 2 have pretty well told him to buck his ideas up again and work a little harder. And he's walking the dog in the park. and he sits down and starts to think about trying a bit harder and whether it would work. And then the dog, which is enormous, slumps down behind him. And he comes to a conclusion, which is, well, the dog is called Turfy. He says, I'm really like you, Turfy, aren't I? I'm just like you. I'm just me and I'm just there. And that's it. And his thinking kind of stops there. It's self-acceptance. It's not smugness. It's self-acceptance. It's not idleness. It's just this ability to be yourself, which so few of us have.
From the point of view of writing a story, you've got a central character here who seems to have no problems in his life. And yet we know that stories need problems. So the problems have to come from somewhere else. Otherwise, you have no story.
Well, I'm not anymore even convinced about Nikki. But certainly some of the children in the class do have a problem. I mean, Akeem is so tense about his flute playing in public, and it takes Finley to calm him down. Juliet is a case in point. Juliet's had a really nasty tragedy happen in the family 2 or 3 years before the book begins that she's gradually getting over. She's obviously been through a stage where she found it almost impossible to go to school. And she's obviously been in therapy, dealing with anxiety, and she's getting on top of it. And she starts the school trying to be very brave and seeing how she can manage and spending time with Finley and watching Finley and just seeing Finley being so calm always seems to work. Just she doesn't even need to talk to him some of the time. I mean, some of the time when she has problems and is worried about her life, she does. And somehow whatever he says seems to help her. One of the things I think that is most interesting about children is that they can have almost every problem that they have, but they can always grow towards the light. And it doesn't really take frightfully much. One of the boys whose dad is in prison, he's teased. His name is Ian Barr, and he's teased with the name Ian Bars. And that really upsets him until he's talking to Finley. And Finley says something that just calms him down. And he realizes that, yeah, it's not, he's a thin, tall, thin boy. It isn't that bad a nickname. And also, he gets to see his own dad a lot more than Finley does, because Finley's father's separated and gone up to Shetland. So the others do have problems. I have to say that I've never written books in which people had dreadful problems. Because when you look around you, and I think because I live in a very small community, and I get the local paper and it's just full of good news. I mean, honestly, it could be called the Good News Gazette. Um, and you realize that although dreadful things do happen in life, you get a really bad sense of proportion about them from reading nationals. Because if you read nationals, every bad thing that has happened everywhere in the world is brought to your attention, usually with photographs. Whereas in a very local paper, all you read about is people who've raised money for this and people who've helped out with that and people who've been astonishingly wonderful about the other. It's the equivalent of reading a local paper, this book. It's not grueling in any way.
I just want to come back to you, Anne, because when I asked that question, you started off by saying, I'm not sure I even agree with that anymore. And in a way, that's an interesting thing to explore. Can you have a story then that doesn't have a problem or some kind of complication in it?
Well, I suppose complications you would need, wouldn't you? Flaubert said happiness writes white, and we kind of know what he means. And I think dreadful people are always very interesting in books. I mean, my adult novel, people say, oh, I don't like Anne's books because I don't like anybody in them. And you think, well, actually, what I most about writing them was about dreadful people. Children are so interesting in themselves. You only have to have two to know that they couldn't be more different. If you have chalk first, you'll have cheese second, and vice versa. Even then, they don't actually have to have real problems for you to be fascinated by them, the way that they respond differently. And when you've got 30 in this class, they're like kaleidoscope. And the way that they reflect on each other, the way their moods refract on each other, the fact that some of them come in the morning in a grumpy mood, that some of them are tense about exams and others didn't even know they were happening until somebody said, now take out your pen. I mean, children are so remarkably different and curious.
Let's have a look at one of these questions. So it's from Samana, I believe.
Do you find that you use your previous characters as points of reference when writing newer stories? Hearing you talk about Finley really reminds me of Stolly from Apple Cloud 9, one of my absolute favorites. Thank you. Stolly changed me. Well, the answer is no, no, I don't. No, I don't. I mean, each book you come to has different people in it. And although I know the characters of all the people in all the older books, often I don't remember their names. I will remember Solly because he's such an individual. In books for much younger children, you often actually wouldn't even remember their names and nothing about their characters, because for younger children, you're starting at the beginning, going on to the end, and then stopping, and it's mostly story led rather than character led. Whereas all of my books for children over 9 are character led. And I suppose there's a multitude of characters, and they're infinite, aren't they? There will be children who have echoes of other children. And here is this child who has, you could argue, echoes of Stolly. Yes, you could. But Stolly's a live wire and this one isn't. So, no, I don't find that. No.
Mm. You made a comment when we were talking just a little while ago about children being odd. And one of the teachers in this book does say young people are so odd. But actually, to the young, old people are another country too, aren't they?
Yeah, oh yes. I mean, to be fair, everybody's odd, aren't they? I mean, that old rustic saying that we were always being quoted of all the world's a bit strange except for you and me, and even you're a bit odd sometimes, or something like that. That's where the interest of being a novelist is, I think. I really do. Think you think, why am I sitting here making up stories at my age, and I've been happy doing it all my life? And it is because people are infinitely interesting. And you know that in the people that you know around you. I mean, you look around you and and even the people you think are probably dead boring, if you can only get them telling their own story, you usually end up finding that they are not boring. Well, they may still be boring, but their life it's is extraordinary how they ended up that way.
Let's just talk a little bit about the time when this story is set. It's at the transition into secondary school. It's year 7. I wondered if that was a particularly significant period. It is a period of big change for children, but why in particular write it at that point?
Transition year is a very interesting year because obviously you've been head honchos in the primary school. In a primary school, you watch these children who are at the top in age, and they've got quite a lot of responsibility. I mean, they're treated as if they're much more sensible. They're given jobs to do. They're not watched all the time. And they are the tallest and the biggest. And they take responsibilities like the friendship bench and things like that. And then they move to a school that is often 3, 4, 5 times bigger. Some of these children in schools now, I mean, I look at them on the way to school here, and I think you must be 6'2", and you're probably still only in the 3rd year of your secondary schooling, and they're absolutely astonishing. So how they manage when, they're little. I mean, a lot of the boys that start secondary school haven't even gone into their proper growth spurt yet. So the difference in physical build and height between the ones even halfway up the school and the beginners is enormous. That must be pretty intimidating. Then you've got the responsibility of getting to different classrooms, not always having the same teacher. That's a big thing. I have one chaotic daughter and just keeping her books in line for herself was a huge thing. And I have one grandchild who's not even allowed to keep one of his language books. The teacher got so exasperated by him never showing up with it that she impounds it at the end of every lesson just so that it's there next time. So there's a lot to be done in that transition year. The atmospheres are different, the smells are different. I mean, I'm well aware of this because I was in a plate glass primary school. I went to Wallerstein County Primary School in Fareham. And that was built, I suppose, straight after the war. I mean, it had those huge plate glass windows where you actually sweltered in the summer. And then my dad was moved with his job up to Northampton. And I went to Northampton High School for Girls. And the transition year was actually held in a beautiful old house that had curtains, furniture, and mirrors. It was an old house. They'd shoved a few of those old Dickensian sort of wooden desks in each room. And it had a garden with a fish pond and flowers. I couldn't have believed it. I mean, you assume that every school is like the one you go to. And then I moved to something that was, it's like stepping back 100 years. It was quite extraordinary. And the first lesson I went to, they were in a uniform, which I'd never been in before, and they were reading Bevis by Richard Jefferies. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a class of 11-year-olds who could do that now, I should think. They were all grumbling to the teacher about the fact it was so boring. So boring. And I remember sitting there in this beautiful room with carpets and curtains, the whole thing, thinking, you're so ungrateful. You're so ungrateful. This place is wonderful. In fact, Bevis is extremely boring, if you want my opinion. And the last book we read in primary school was The Hobbit, which I adored. So, I mean, swings and roundabouts.
Did you want to say anything about the 3 terms?
I wanted to show how everybody develops during the year. I wanted to show how they, as it were, bed down with each other. And so going through the whole year was sensible. Splitting it into terms seemed absolutely natural. And so you watch the development of Catherine, who is a bit of a maths whiz, and the way that they actually begin to be amazed by her and how the teachers deal with all the problems as the year goes by, and how Julian Goodhue, I can't say gets more confident, but he certainly knows his children better towards the end, though they can still mystify him. And of course, Juliet's development, which I think is an interesting one, because in the end, a lot of them don't want to sit by Finley for too long. Maybe he's just too peaceful, too restful, too calming. They could find him a bit frustrating and exasperating, perhaps at moments. But all of a sudden, Juliet packs up and suddenly appears at the empty desk next to him, and there she stays, and nobody says a word about it. The very fact that a child like her would suddenly up sticks and move without even asking the teacher into the empty space beside Finley is quite interesting. It's the first time she's actually done something very brave without showing great anxiety about it beforehand. Yeah.
I have to say, Catherine was one of my favourite characters too. And I love the fact that they give the timetabling that is perplexing the teachers to sort out as a sort of homework task. We do have a question, so I'm just going to put that on the screen. Is Finley neurodivergent, and is Catherine? I'm sure you have something to say about that, Anne.
Well, it depends how you define all these things, doesn't it? I mean, they're very different. Finley's obviously right at one end of the spectrum of tranquility and imperturbability. You won't find anybody more so than him. Catherine's right at the spectrum of being one of those children. I mean, at one point we catch her reading a book which is called Some Thoughts on the Something Something Hypothesis. I can't even remember. I think this is a stretch too far for many teachers because there's computer people that do this, but she does sort out the hobbies timetable and then has a go at the main timetable, which is defeating Mr. Brownlow. And he's embarrassed about asking. I mean, I think I've probably gone a step too far there, but it's funny. It's very funny. I went to school. We had a maths whiz. My ex-husband went to Cheltenham Grammar, and he claims he was in a maths group all of his own and worked in a cupboard like she does. Now, people who look at him will think, well, is he neurodivergent or isn't he? He'd just say he was very, very good at maths. I might say that Finley is just very, very, very calm. I don't know. It depends whether you're happy labeling people or whether, you think as long as they can manage, and that's the issue really, isn't it? That they're both managing and people are managing with them. So there would be other people, and this is not my area of expertise at all. I only write what I see, who would argue that they are neurodivergent by their definition, but people's definitions surely are different. I don't know. It's a question I can't really answer.
We've got one more question, and so here we are.
Well, is it a quiet book? Should there be more books like that around? It's not for me to say what books there should be around. I read widely and I like reading different sorts of books. And I know that there are some times when I will pick up a book and I will think, no, I'm not in the mood for that. I want something more. I don't know. I wouldn't even look for an adjective. I'd just look for a different book and think I'm more in the mood for this. It's not a book that's going to keep you awake at night worrying about anybody. It's not going to raise any deep issues for anybody. I think it's quite a wise read, if I may, into Mrs. Beastie for a moment, but it's also quite light. Quiet. Yeah. I never think of myself as quiet. I mean, I'm quiet when I'm quiet, but when I'm talking to people, I don't think of myself as quiet. In fact, I'm quite famous, aren't I, for being the outspoken and fine, which always astonishes me because I think of myself as actually quite restrained. But there you go. Other people know you better than you know yourself.
I like the fact that you describe it as a wise book. And there are lots of moments in there to give us pause for reflection. I particularly, for instance, enjoyed Julian Goodhue coming in, I think at the beginning of the summer term, where he's ruminating on the kinds of punishment that are given to children, isolation and silence. And it used to be reading in the library that was sometimes given as a punishment. I hope we don't do that anymore. But the notion that some of these punishments should be things that are desirable, actually.
I think that's one of the great laughs in the staff room. I mean, they're not laughing, they're just a bit baffled by it because one of them comes in and points out that everything they would give their eye teeth for themselves is something they use as a disciplinary approach in the school. So you've got one of the teachers who's got two small children and he could absolutely kill for half an hour's peace and quiet. But the punishment of, you go and sit outside by yourself for a moment because you're disrupting the class. So the silence and being on your own is the punishment. Silence. We'd all kill for a bit more of that. That's all I ever heard my mum saying because there were the five of us in this house. And my mum was always saying, all I want is a little bit of peace and quiet. And my dad was saying, all I want is a modicum of hush. And that's all they both of them ever wanted. But a lot of these observations are made by the staff throughout the book. And that then comes back to what I said about it started as a book about the effect that everything would have on Finley. And it ends up as a book about the effect that Finley has on all these other people, which is much more profound.
Absolutely. And that actually is a good point for us to end on and reflect on the children that we work with. I always think we learn as much from them as they learn from us. And in a way, that's what's going on On the Wall. So what I would like to do, first of all, is to thank everybody who came along and joined us this evening and to thank you for those questions. In a moment, Anne is going to read another part from the book. I'm going to ask her just to tell us a little bit about that episode that she's going to read. And then do stick around at the end just for half a minute where I'll flash up on the screen some of the other events that are coming up over the autumn term, over the next few Thursdays. I hope they're all as wonderful as this one, Anne. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you again.
So this last reading I'm going to do is Juliet. And as we've explained, Juliet was deeply, deeply anxious, has had a whole year. Her therapist has more or less moved her onto the very occasional phone call just to clock in with her. She's come to terms with her mum's death. She's actually come to like the two children of her dad's new girlfriend, who has been becoming more of an item through the book. And she's going home. This would be sometime towards the end of the third term. And this bit's called A Stranger. This is a very short vignette. On her way home that day, Juliet walked round a corner and almost bumped into someone smaller than herself who was purposefully striding in the other direction. She wore the same bright turquoise top and grey skirt that Juliet had worn for years at the same primary school, Hilltop. The two passed one another, and the girl walked on. But Juliet couldn't help stopping and turning to stare after her. That could have been me, she was thinking. That's how I must have looked to anyone who happened to walk past me in the street 2 or 3 years ago. She thought about herself back then, that Juliet. It seemed light years ago. She felt as if she were another person now, not just grown older and taller, and wearing a different uniform, but completely different person. That Juliet from before seemed so very distant now, far, far, far away, like someone she'd once read about in an old storybook. If she were to bump into her old self now, she wouldn't recognize her, not at all. Why, that old Juliet would seem a total stranger.